Welcome to CSIS for this roundtable. What's next for TB and NCDs? Observations from the UN General Assembly high-level meetings. I'm Steve Morrison, Senior Vice President here at CSIS, where I direct our Global Health Policy Center. I want to extend that welcome to those, of course, who are joining us online. This session is being webcast live, and the video will be posted subsequently on both the CSIS and Kaiser websites. And we are thrilled to be able to put this event on jointly with the Kaiser Family Foundation. And a special thanks to Jennifer Cates, Vice President and Director of Global Health and HIV Policy, for all her help. She's with us today as a roundtable speaker and has been a close and valued partner for almost 2 decades. As many of you know, she has produced a prodigious amount of analysis of donor investments in global health and done an amazing amount of work in mapping the major institutions and programs and funding streams, and is a very revered expert on HIV, both domestic and at home, where she's been working on those issues for almost 3 decades. I also wish to extend special thanks to Craig Pulaski and Tiffany Ford Fields from Kaiser Family Foundation for their valuable support. Here at CSIS, several of my colleagues have invested a considerable amount of time and care in making today happen, especially Aishwarya Rajay, Sarah Allender, Claire Felton, Michaela Semano have also been very supportive and generous with their time. We're very lucky today to have a remarkable assembly of talent and long-standing friends and colleagues. We're going to try to answer three questions over the course of the afternoon. First is to tell us what happened in New York. And after that, we're going to ask, well, tell us what happens next. And then third, what are we supposed to make of these extravaganzas? So we'll try to move that conversation through that sequence, and we'll welcome your input. Normally, we have these conversations, and then we reach a point in the flow where we say, okay, let's welcome everybody from the audience. We have a small audience here in person today, and I think we should sort of open the gate here, and as we're going through the course of this, if you have questions, interventions you care to, just put your hand up. We'll acknowledge you, and someone will bring a microphone to you. I didn't mention John Muntz, who's helped us put the live video stream together. John, thank you so much for your help. Eric Gooseby is joining us remotely from San Francisco. I'll be turning to him in a few minutes to kick things off. He is the UN Special Envoy on Tuberculosis, appointed to that post by the UN Secretary General. He's served in that role for more than 3.5 years, through the entire period when the concept of a TB high-level meeting was first conceived and moved forward, and I think deserves enormous credit for getting us to this moment. He is familiar, I'm certain, to virtually everyone here in the audience, both online and in person. From 2009 to 2013, he served in the Obama administration in the dual role of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and Ambassador at Large. That was a period in which health diplomacy emerged as a big theme of our foreign policy in health, and he was a lead person in moving that agenda forward and has obviously carried it forward on the tuberculosis front. Prior to that, he headed the Pangea Global AIDS Foundation for 9 years, and prior to that, served in the Clinton administration, where he was director of the Ryan White CARE Act at the U.S. Health and Human Services Department. While he is not out envoying, he is at the University of California, San Francisco as professor of medicine and director of the Global Health Delivery and Diplomacy Institute. I'm going to quickly introduce the other speakers that we'll have, and then offer a few remarks, and then we'll move into the program. Peter Mamakos joins us from the White House, where he's the Director of Global Health and Development at the National Security Council, where he has served since July of 2017. Prior to that, he was Director of Multilateral Relations at the Office of Global Affairs at HHS. And he's going to tell us today who wrote that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. Lois Pace is President and Executive Director of Global Health Council, a position she's occupied since December of 2016 and has really shown remarkable leadership in that role. She's now approaching the second anniversary. Prior to that, when we first got to know her, she was leading global health policy work at Livestrong, based out of Austin, but with a big presence here in Washington. Before that, at the American Cancer Society. Robert Newman is our newest non-resident senior associate here at CSIS. He's familiar to many of you for the many leadership roles he's occupied over the past 2 decades. He was Vice President Global Head for Tuberculosis at J&J. Prior to that, Country Director for CDC in Cambodia. He was Managing Director for Policy and Performance at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance in Geneva, and for 5 years served as Director of the Global Malaria Program at the World Health Organization. I'm very proud to tell you that he was, like me, a BA in English in college, and then went on to get his MD degree. A few remarks about our discussions today, and I'll try and cluster these into 2 sets of remarks and then turn to Eric to open things up. First, these high-level meetings on global health are a relatively recent tool of diplomacy. There aren't that many of them. In 2001, we had the meeting on HIV, which was dramatic and highly consequential and historic, but it was only a decade later that we had the second on NCDs, which was followed 3 years later by a review meeting. In 2016 was the high-level meeting on illicit drugs. Now, that bridged law enforcement, crime fighting with public health approaches, which is a central tension in talking about substance disorders, but I think it deserves acknowledgement as a high-level meeting that falls into global health. And then in 2018, the subject of today, NCDs, noncommunicable diseases, and tuberculosis. We've never had a year in which we had twin meetings, and that'll be something that we talk about today. And it's already been scheduled as a lead-in to what is going to happen next fall, which is the high-level meeting on universal health coverage. So when you look at that pattern, these high-level meetings are becoming more frequent and more clustered. They are, by definition, expensive. They require a major mobilization of effort by governments, international organizations, advocates, civil society groups, envoys, NGOs, private sector actors. They spawn countless spin-off satellites, breakfasts, late dinners, and various other events that are, in their own right, oftentimes quite important. And they're, as I mentioned earlier, an important new instrument of diplomacy. I think it's important to emphasize that these meetings emerge out of hope and with high expectations. Across all of them is the rationale that these issues, the issues that are being treated, have graduated into a new level of significance, where they warrant high-level attention, not just by health officials, but by heads of state, by finance officials, by global media, and others. And the expectation is that they will issue consequential declarations that lay out goals, that inspire new financing, and that devise means of holding parties to account and laying a pathway into the future that extends beyond these meetings. They're fundamentally, I think, about shifting money and shifting policies to new priorities. That certainly was central to the meetings on both tuberculosis and NCDs. Each of these meetings is different, and I think today we'll hear a bit about how the TB and NCD meetings are different. Some are more impactful than others. Each of them reveal deep tensions, most typically between private sector interests and public health interests. And certainly the TB and NCD meetings made that very clear. But they were not the only meeting that's done that. I think each one of these bring forward many of the core tensions and fault lines that divide people. How we reach a judgment about the impact and value of these meetings is not simple and cannot necessarily be done quickly or categorically. The high-level meetings mark a moment in history. They set down new markers and expectations. And they sometimes tie forward. The TB and NCD meetings tie forward to the universal health coverage meeting that's coming next fall. And there are continuous threads in terms of leadership when you think about the Japanese role as co-host on tuberculosis and playing a key role in the universal health coverage. TB, TB at long last, I think, this was a forlorn and neglected disease that many people were very pleased to see was getting its day in the sun. And there was a lot of discussion in the ministerial, and we'll hear more from Eric in a moment, a lot of discussion going back to the ministerial in Moscow last year and many of the other meetings, that many of the pessimistic assumptions about tuberculosis were beginning to be transcended, that people were having higher hopes, its priority and visibility was rising. Big burden states were stepping forward in taking leadership in new and important ways. Eric was appointed as a special envoy. Many of the things we had heard, knew and had heard for years about tuberculosis and where things were moving and what was possible were suddenly beginning to congeal. My second point, and then I will be very brief here, my second point is that these two high-level meetings come at an interesting and particularly problematic moment in history. In both of them, the central issue is whether donors will act to expand foreign assistance and whether national governments will pursue expanded taxation and regulation of tobacco, alcohol, and food products in terms of NCDs, and will there be concerted action to open affordable access to medications through exercise of sovereign rights under TRIPS or through new modifications of intellectual property, and whether countries will embrace the notion seriously of national action plans in both fronts. Yet these meetings occur in the midst of strained budgets, many conflicting priorities, and they occur in the midst of a populist nationalism that's on the ascent in several countries, most notably for our purposes here in the United States, in the UK, and across Europe. And that nationalism is one that brings with it a certain skepticism of foreign aid, multilateralism, alliances, migration, and an excess emphasis on sovereignty. And just to point out, I mean, President Trump came to in his address and was very forthright on September 25th in denouncing the ideology of globalism, that we would go it alone as a sovereign actor, that would be much higher in selective use of foreign aid, and that there would be, we reject that ideology and that we would reject uncontrolled migration, and we're taking a hard look at U.S. foreign assistance. That was the opening moment. One of the questions, I think, for the United States is what does that mean? Does that get in the way of having a forward-leaning approach on these two programs or not? This populist approach is also putting forward an anti-tax and anti-regulation ethos, which of course regulation and taxes are fundamental on NCDs. And we're in the midst of very tight budgets, not just us, but I think most of the donor governments. CBO just came out with its estimate of the deficit, which is now running at $800 billion. After our great tax cuts, and even in the midst of historic wealth generation in our country, with a projection that this could cross to $1 trillion next year. What is that going to imply in the future in terms of budget cuts and having latitude for expanded foreign assistance? TB and especially NCDs put a spotlight on the private sector, and they really run headlong into many of these ideological issues that we face. So let's move on to our roundtable and hear what we can from our participants here and get the conversation moving. As I said, we're trying to do this on a conversational basis. We want our speakers to come in with lively, provocative, short remarks and have it be very interactive. And we're going to first ask Eric to open up. I'd like to invite, before you begin, Eric, I'd like to invite our speakers to come sit up here with us. So, Eric, thanks so much for being with us. And why don't you kick things off? What happened?
Well, thanks, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be with this illustrious group of friends who have been looking at this problem for many years. Well, I think you've given a nice overview of high-level meetings in general. I participated in that in all of the HIV meetings and was in the Office of HIV/AIDS Policy with Sandy Thurman at the time that Ambassador Holbrooke decided to move forward with that speech. It was a long discussion to tee him up to making the statements around HIV and specifically linking it to a security issue. But it did allow for a remarkable pivot into highlighting both the tragedy of HIV, that the largest number of individuals contracted with HIV, 73% living in sub-Saharan Africa, receiving at that time less than 50,000 individuals receiving antiretroviral therapy in 2003. The disparity, the unavailability of effective drugs that stopped progression featured a reaction in the global community around the inappropriateness of that, the arbitrariness of it, and really began the drumbeat that what I would say resulted in the substantive discussions that allowed donors and other foundation support to converge on establishing the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria, and was critical in the thinking in President Bush's administration to make that initial investment in PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. I think the high-level meeting for tuberculosis, though, was an opportunity to feature a disease that is thousands of years old, is poorly understood in terms of its natural history and its immunologic response, how immunity is conferred, what our immune system does in an infected individual, and then secondarily, not only how it moves through an individual, but how tuberculosis moves through communities. Our understanding of that has been episodic and truncated, where it's focused on for a few years and then not continued. HIV saw a crescendo of knowledge through natural history, pathophysiology, opportunistic infections, AIDS-related malignancies, antiretroviral therapy. All of those were large areas of focus for research motors like NIH, like Wellcome Trust, like government investments and efforts, all aligned to further elucidation of those specifics, which fed our ability to develop diagnostic tests and antiretroviral therapies. That then had to be translated into a domestic reflection, a domestic investment, and programs needed to be stood up that made those advances, those scientific advances, available to those who suffered from the burden of the disease. HIV had all of that benefit that came out of that initial interest in the 80s and 90s and culminated in the global inequity of north-south, lack of north-south movement of treatment. I think all came together in that 2000 meeting with Ambassador Holbrooke as a stain on the public health response globally, and was generally embraced as this was not acceptable and I would say change conversation at donor foundation level to realize that it indeed was part of our purview and responsibility to understand that disparity and to work our resources toward narrowing that disparity. TB, in this high-level meeting, for the first time in my career, put an element of hope in front of the global health community, that indeed this was a disease. We know how to diagnose it, we know how to prevent it, we know how to treat it, and indeed in 84% of cases know how to cure it for drug-sensitive disease. And we have not been able to stand up and sustain delivery systems that effectively drops the number of new infections. We still sit at over 10 million new infections annually, 1.4 million deaths annually from this disease, over 4,200 deaths a day. Those numbers reverberate in our global health discussions as a outlier for a disease that we know so much about already, and have stood up delivery systems since World War II that have waxed and waned in the domestic support that they receive. So it is my hope that this meeting allows us to understand the burden of disease, to understand how out of those 10 million infections, each country reflects a portion of that burden, and each country needs to understand where it currently is with its initial domestic investment, understand the donor investment, and match that up against the met and unmet needs of the populations impacted in their countries. I would just finally say that understanding that, knowing your epidemic, and then pivoting from knowing your epidemic into understanding access points for specific high-risk groups in your targeted population becomes the task that each and every year you need to revisit and realign your delivery system to better identify, enter, and capture those people in care and treatment services that retains them for a period of 6 months for TB to complete their treatment. It's my hope that this convening starts on a multiplicity of levels, efforts that converge and allow their resources and program efforts to be additive in any given country experience, and that civil society, invigorated by the convening at the high-level meeting, understand that their effectiveness is only realized through their organization that occurs in each country. The domestic civil society organization is the most important, to be that voice that engages local political leadership in what the response is doing currently and what it needs to do in the future, and to hold them accountable year after year after year with that. So the importance of that civil society input now is the piece that needs to crescendo post-high-level meeting.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks for your service. We're going to move to Peter Mamakas from the National Security Council. Peter, tell us what you think happened.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks, Steve, and thanks to CSIS for putting this panel together, and we welcome this opportunity. The U.S. welcomed the high-level meeting as an opportunity, on TB as an opportunity to marshal international resources. As you said, TB has always been the neglected disease. The United States has been the world leader for decades in responding to TB. We provide almost half the R&D money, and we've been the leading bilateral donor for TB treatment around the world. I personally am hopeful that we might be approaching a threshold, as we did with malaria control. Perhaps Rob can talk about this back in 2005, where we're really able to take new tools, new treatments, new diagnostics, and just new science about the understanding of the transmission of the disease to take us into a different era. We were pleased at the high-level meeting to be able, NIH launched a new strategy on TB research. that looks at better understanding TB pathogenesis and identifying biomarkers. We're looking into research for less toxic treatments of shorter duration and vaccines. USAID Administrator Mark Green announced our new global accelerator to end tuberculosis that will leverage additional resources from countries, private sector partners, and local organizations. And we are also working at supporting a performance-based measurement system that will help countries that want to develop accountability frameworks. And this will also help stimulate additional domestic financing and include work with other sectors, including the faith-based sectors. I think for us, the clear messages coming out of this meeting, first of all, more R&D is needed to bring these tools to use, and including a better understanding of which latent TB cases are in danger of becoming active, so that we don't have to try to treat every latent TB case in the world. We're also pleased to be able to announce that the Trump administration, through our PEPFAR program, is going to immediately begin rewriting its country operation plan guidance for HIV-TB co-infection to ensure that all clients, HIV clients, are screened for active TB and tested, and vice versa. And we will also start expanding screening to households of newly diagnosed TB cases among our HIV clients. And finally, one of our strongest messages in this was that we need to ensure accountability. One of the unresolved issues from the declaration was about the establishment of an independent review mechanism. And so we want to continue to push for that and are working with other partners on that. On NCDs, we were pleased as well to take part. Our session was chaired by Deputy HHS Secretary Eric Hargan, who also served on the WHO Independent High-Level Commission on NCDs. As Deputy Secretary Hargan has said, we cannot wish away the NCD challenge. Addressing them requires comprehensive, cost-effective, evidence-based, and multi-sectoral strategies. So we welcomed WHO's report from earlier this year. We're pleased that it offers recommendations that can help accelerate global action against NCDs. The private sector, indeed, we see as part of this. Nearly all the world's food is produced and sold through the private sector. So we're not going to make progress on this issue without their involvement. And we're pleased that the Commission report reflected a new spirit of collaboration with the private sector. That's the only way that we're going to be able to reach our goals of reducing premature mortality by 1/3. So yeah, I think in summary, we thought the high-level meeting was a great opportunity to focus, to help develop consensus on what are the things that we can all do to move forward.
Thank you. When you said that the NIH released the new research strategy, is this a re-energizing or redoubling of effort? It's not tied to budget so much as it is elevating the priority around the research agenda. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. I mean, we've identified 5 core strategies that we want to emphasize. I mean, you know, I think we can see that we're turning a corner here, and by getting these new shorter treatments out that reduce toxicity and improve adherence, this is really important. The science around latent TB is coming along very quickly, and so I think it's about understanding these tools and how to apply them. I mean, to me, an analogy would be, again, where we were with malaria, understanding, you know, the science around herd immunity, and that by using all these tools in a concerted way, you could really have a population level impact, is what we're trying to get through this strategy in TB as well.
Thank you. Lois, you had the opportunity to spend the week up there talking to lots of people, listening to speeches, attending various conversations. So what did you hear when you were I asked Lois particularly to share what she thought the view was across the multiple constituencies, stakeholders who were there, because there's a rich environment of those. And if you can help unpack sort of what did you hear?
Yeah, so you know, it was a busy week, especially considering we were trying to do a lot with the week that is UNGA. As Steve said, you know, having a couple of high-level meetings on top of everything else we already try to accomplish. was something we went into knowing it might be a challenge, but I think the advocacy community really showed up in important ways. I have to start, though, by really acknowledging, I think a lot of people have talked about who hasn't shown up, and I think that's important, an important metric, but who did show up is a question that I ask myself. And the people who came, I mean, if you haven't watched Nandita's opening keynote remarks at the TB high-level meeting, you need to go back, you need to leave here and go watch it, because I think she was the only person who actually received a standing ovation, and a well-deserved one at that. I mean, she really drove home the importance of us all paying attention to this issue, and it was really exciting, I think, for a lot of us who stand on sort of the advocacy side of things to hear her and see her in action and to have her represent such an important community at an important time. I think similarly, we at Global Health Council were able to sponsor a person from the Philippines, Hannah, who came in and talked about her son living with a heart condition. And there were, I think, many people throughout that week who were sharing their own stories or bringing in advocates from in-country, to Eric's point, who were sharing their stories, who were talking about the importance of addressing these issues, not just sort of in the halls of the UN, but back home. So I just wanted to sort of start by acknowledging that, which I think is really critically important. But then, of course, there were some shortcomings, and I think the biggest one is that there weren't a lot of heads of state or heads of government in the room to hear these fascinating stories and to really be moved by them in a way that we hope they would be. So, and I'm sure everyone has seen some of the metrics from Stop TB or from NCD Alliance on the handful of heads of state who were in the room, but I mean, if we're looking to these meetings to really kind of get those types of individuals to show up, I would say that a lot of advocates really felt like we fell short. Otherwise, we can have these meetings at World Health Assembly or some other health forum, but the point was to go beyond the health ministers, right? So that's something to think about and work on and maybe talk about as we go through the day. You guys have already touched on sort of the shortcomings when it comes to kind of a lack of national action or framework, so I won't dig into that too much. But I will say on something else in the declarations that I haven't seen or heard come through yet, which is looking at the NCD declaration in particular, the fact that they didn't have a price tag attached to that is, I think, still disappointing for that particular community. So I know that in TB, rightfully, they were talking about sort of a lack of accountability there, but they did have money attached in a way that for NCDs, they might have that framework, even dating back to 2011, but there's still not a price tag. And I think that that's one of the reasons why they really wanted to continue this momentum around their own high-level dialogues, is because they've never really seen that kind of commitment come through. The other point I think it's worth stating is this sort of back and forth on taxation. It's something we saw in the 2011 declaration. We didn't see it in 2018, and we heard that there were some disagreement around that for this year. And so speaking to sort of the tension between civil society and industry, I think it's just very important to highlight that as a shortcoming given the evidence base around taxation and NCDs. I'll end by touching on a few bright spots, because I want to end on a positive note, just the way I started. So for NCDs, for example, we moved to this 5x5 framework, really seeing mental health highlighted. That's something going back to 2011 we didn't see, and I think that was really important. And if anyone noticed, Lady Gaga did an op-ed today with Tedros, which was very cool. We also, I would say, I think people might have missed the balance that was being struck in a lot of these. So there wasn't this fight between prevention and treatment as we might have seen with HIV years ago. There was an emphasis on R&D as well as service delivery. So I think that's all very good, and I wanna be sure we take note of that. And then finally, I don't think we did this enough, but there was a little bit of integration that if you're looking, you'll notice in the declaration. So whether it's in the NCD declaration, them talking about the importance of liaising with TB and other issues like UHC, or in the TB declaration, I'm sure there was mention of HIV. So that was coming up in some of the side events. I think we can do more in this SDG era to talk about development broadly and think across the SDGs. But I do see that as an opening, especially as we look towards 2019. So those are my initial impressions.
Thank you. I mean, reading the press accounts of both of the high-level meetings, there was a lot of grumbling, right? There was a lot of grumbling. And that's normal.
Yeah.
Grumbling is normal.
Especially for advocates.
I mean, if there hadn't been grumbling, it would have been surprising, right?
Yeah,
mean,
I think so.
Activists exist in order to grumble and put pressure on folks.
I don't know about that.
And ask for more. And putting the focus back on the financing gap, the leadership gap. Why aren't we talking more about taxation and regulation? Why aren't we talking more about affordable access in concrete terms? I mean, those are the predictable touch points that the activists, and the question is, while people had to register their dissatisfaction, did people also register those that you were, the constituents that you're talking about, did they also register their sense of, well, this, despite all of that, this was still a major step forward, both of these instances. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd love a show of hands, but I think there are people in this room who would say, well, look, I mean, there hasn't been an op-ed, I don't think, on TV in the New York Times, for example, at least not in recent years. And so that was exciting to see that level of recognition. I think even just seeing how we were emboldened as advocates is also very exciting. Again, getting back to this, the importance of the ground game is critical, and we have to show up if nothing else, and we can then take that message back home or amplify that message in a way that's not really being done by our governments. And so to the extent we can sort of make sure the public is aware of these as issues, we can sort of embolden donors, and again sort of get back to the ground to push for this national level action. I think that that's seen as a positive. So we're not saying we've gotten everything on our list. Again, as advocates, we really do shoot for the moon. But I do think that this was an important point in time that we all acknowledge that we can sort of leverage and look to as a marker, so that we can continue to hold each other and other stakeholders accountable.
Thank you. Rob, thank you for going to New York on behalf of CSIS. And
my pleasure.
Rob has two excellent commentaries, which we will be posting in the next 2 days, I would say.
I think so.
They're getting copy edited and will be soon posted, so please keep an eye out for those pieces. Tell us what you think happened, Rob.
I want to use this to react, I think, to sort of keep this as a conversation. And I really like the way you started with the positive. I mean, I think particularly on the TB, that message of hope that we actually were on the world stage. I mean, that I think is a key. It is really a key message. I guess I feel differently about the two meetings in that, I'm not sure the message of hope for me was as strong with the NCD, and that's a third meeting, it's a third bite at the apple, and you're wondering why isn't there more data in the political declaration to show what's been accomplished? Why isn't there greater accountability shown for where we are? Why isn't that better linked up with the other efforts that are going on? So I guess I see them differentially. I think that, of course, I think you highlighted with TB, it did get a lot of attention, and yet at the same time, it is disappointing that there weren't more heads of state in the room. And I think we can't shy away from that. And I think, when we get to the conversation part, Eric, getting your thoughts on that. You started with talking about the first high-level meeting you both did about HIV. And I guess one of the things that I've learned in recent years as I moved out of the malaria community where I'd been for 15 years to HIV, where I was working on Cambodia, is just how active the community was, how much pull and push there was from that community. And I think if TB and the ambitions of TB and NCDs are going to be realized, then that community needs to continue to learn and take playbooks from HIV. How do we really demand? I mean, the fact is that if there were the sort of community and activist demand for TB as we have seen from HIV, I think there would have been more heads of state in the room. And the fact that there wasn't allowed those heads of state to be absent. So how do we hold their feet to the fire? How do we make sure that they can't be absent? There were some great things said, which is that, if we're treating 6 million people a year for TB, it would only take one out of every 5 of those people to become an activist for doing something about TB, to create 1 million activists a year. That's a lot of activists. Why aren't we doing a better job of channeling the energy of people being treated for TB into activism? Now, activism should be for domestic and international resources. It should be for access to the tools we have today. It should be innovation for tomorrow. In a meeting that was hosted in DC the week before UNGA, Tony Fauci talked about just how different the state of play is in TB in terms of innovation when you compare it to where we are with HIV. I mean, we're still sort of in the dark ages. We're making progress. We have new tools. But, you know, we need some more transformative tools if we're going to realize those TB ambitions. And so, you know, I think there was good discussion in New York about that. I think there is, you know, a recognition around the need for innovation. But I think that we are going to really have to figure out how to galvanize that community. I think the other thing that was interesting, and you alluded to it, you know, we had these 2 high-level meetings, and while you put a nice spin that there was some linkage, I think we have to acknowledge that it wasn't the strongest linkage that it could have been. And why is that? Why do we continue in global health to work in silos in the way that we do? And when we're looking ahead to 2019 and the high-level meeting on UHC, we have such an opportunity, I think, to think about that. And yet I was struck in the side meeting how little reference was made to how this was going to fit into UHC and into PH, primary health care. And, you know, if we are going to increase access to the tools we have today for TB and capitalize on the tools for tomorrow, we have to figure out what the health system challenges are. And while there was some of that, I guess that wasn't quite as robust as it could have been. You know, lastly, I think the thing that I was really struck with during the week were the sort of patient voices. And at least in the TB side meetings I attended, you know, I was so struck by the harrowing tales of people and what it means to live through being treated for TB. You know, the terrible medicines that some people, particularly with drug-resistant TB, are subjected to. And that is changing, but not fast enough. It gets after this issue of how do we accelerate the uptake of innovation once we spent hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to get there. And maybe I'll just end on the issue of stigma. And I think, you know, I was really struck by the comments of a number of TB survivors that what's killing people with TB is stigma, and that there's still such stigma. And I think, again, the HIV community has made so much stride in this. It'd be interesting, Eric, I think in the conversation to hear how you think we can catch up to what's happened in HIV. But people said that there's now more stigma associated with TB than there is with HIV. And that comment really struck me, and I think it'd be interesting to examine how, you know, how is that preventing us getting where we want to go, and how are we going to get there?
Thank you. Jen.
Great, so thank you. Thanks to CSIS for doing this event with us, as always. Since I'm last, I'm just going to try to share some broad thoughts, which actually pick up on a lot of what we heard and we did not coordinate. But I'll be a little academic about it. There are 3 things I wanted to say about these 2 meetings. One was the issue of framing. 2 was the issue of timing. And really what I mean by that is policy opportunities, windows of opportunity. And 3, a little bit about the USG role in both of these. So on the framing question, I'm very fortunate to be able to teach every fall at Johns Hopkins CSIS, and I teach graduate students who focus on development, and my colleague Josh Michaud and I teach them about global health policy. And one of the things we talk with them about every fall is what framing means and how you frame global health for policy. We go through the history, and we talk about the different ways it's been framed, and the security argument, the moral argument, the human rights approach, economic, and we have a lot of discussion with them. They're fascinated by this, and they always want to know what's like the perfect frame. And we talk to them about how we actually don't know what the perfect frame is, and framing is very context specific, and sometimes it's multiple frames, and the frames change over time. So when I was thinking about the current era and these 2 meetings, and these 2 focus areas, I think it's a really difficult one for framing right now. Steve alluded to this, but because we're now in I think it used to be, and certainly at the time of the HIV meeting in 2001, there was an increasing appreciation of globalism and the interconnectedness of the world that allowed different frames to play out and be supportive. I think now because there's this sort of juxtaposition between a bit of a globalism over here and populism over here, it makes the frames more complicated in the international arena. And it's not clear to me that the right formulas for the framing are there yet for TB and NCDs. And I think it's an open question as to whether bringing the 2 together helped that or made it harder. I just don't know. What is the frame that we could use? Some things that people have said that I was also thinking about that I think both those movements are doing but could do more One is the patient advocate. So yes, the voices of people affected by different diseases and challenges are really important. The civil society activist is really important, but I think what HIV did was bring those two together and didn't keep them separate. And I think to the extent that the TB community and the NCD community can do that, it really cuts through that juxtaposition of globalism and populism, right? Because it's really about the patient advocate and the person in front of you that can break down a barrier. And I think both communities are doing it, but to me, that's really the direction to think about going. The second is both these challenges, and particularly NCDs, are so big in a way. They're too big, and they almost make it possible to not act. So how do we go from big to maybe not small, but tangible bites at this? And we could talk more about what that could look like. And I'm not saying that this isn't happening, but I think at high-level meetings and with documents that are supposed to appeal to global leadership, that's hard. And the last point, and this is one that we talk about in my class a lot, is that different frames are important for different audiences. So you can't do that with a declaration per se, but you can do it with implementation and follow-through. The second point is on timing and windows of opportunity. There's an old concept, well, not old, but I'm old concept in political science about how you have these windows of opportunity or policy windows. You need to have three elements, and sometimes there's more, but one is you have to define a problem, two is you have to have ideas for how to address that problem, and three is you have to have policymakers willing to take on that problem. I'm not sure we always have all those elements in place right now. I think both communities, TB and NCD, have gotten very savvy about defining the problem. We're talking about alternatives that exist, but getting policymakers to take them up and galvanizing the communities around them is the big challenge right now. Whether these two high-level meetings will be enduring and make a difference, one thing I want to say about the HIV meeting, at the time it felt important, but we didn't really know at the time that it was going to be important until after. So part of this is going to be in hindsight. And no one meeting unto itself is going to change things. It really has to be part of a longer narrative. So I think that's important to remember. We all can look back at 2001 and say how significant it was, but it was only significant in its context and what it led to. Lastly, on the USG role, just a couple observations. Very different on TB and NCDs, and I think that's appropriate and just realistic. So on the TB side, as Peter was talking about, I mean, the US has been the bilateral leader, and through Global Fund contributions, the multilateral leader in terms of its financial efforts as well as others. So I think that role is continuing. I think it was really encouraging that new initiatives were announced, and the accelerator, for example, is the kind of concept that has legs and I think gets us, gives them new ideas for moving forward. On NCDs, we have to think about it quite differently. This is not an area where the US is going to make NCDs part of its development portfolio and its bilateral aid. It's just not in a big way. So it's really about how the USG is going to play a role in the international community on norm setting, on TA, on guidance, and on working with partners in other countries. And I think we just have to be realistic about that. To wrap this up, I would just say going forward, thinking about framing, thinking about timing, and then looking ahead in terms of timing at opportunities that may be happening. So it's the UHC meeting next fall, but it's also the Global Fund replenishment. There's the G20 summit and G7. So there are a lot of moments that some of these through lines can continue. And I'll just leave it at that and hope we can get into some of this in discussion.
Thanks so much. I was struck, I'm going to come back to Eric here in a moment. I mean, I was struck that there was less emphasis on the health security threats posed by MDR-TB than I had anticipated. I was expecting much more discussion of that. And in reading over the accounts and the like, it didn't materialize in the way that, and maybe I just had a mistaken understanding of where the issue sat. I was struck by the emphasis on science and R&D, and actually very encouraged by that. And the inclusion of mental health was very welcome and long overdue. I think both conferences brought us back to the reality that the key decider in all of this are the country leadership. And both TB and NCDs, it's choices made by national governments in investing in those. Ultimately, that is going to be the mark of whether there's progress or not. Donors can play a very important role, and as Jen has pointed out, it differs by whether you're talking about TB or talking about NCDs. But this is a different model of change here. These two are ones that rest on national governments choosing to embrace these agendas and move them forward as a budgetary priority, as a national public health priority, as an institutional investment priority. And that gets back to the accountability mechanism. We can have accountability mechanisms that may help hold people and show progress and the like, but it's really the will of those governments to move forward in making those choices. And that the fact that the Global Fund remains, I forget what Peter Sands' remarks was, that on the donor level, the Global Fund accounts for about 65% of the donor dollars for tuberculosis. That it's up for replenishment. In some ways, this is a very advantageous moment to have this meeting occurring when the replenishment occurs in the last quarter of next year, as I recall. The G20, the G7, and the hook forward into the UHC are all pathways for building the momentum, building on the momentum here. So Eric, over to you. Can you tell us, as you think ahead, where are the countries that are going to pick up the ball, in your view, show the greatest progress, and in terms of statesmen and stateswomen that will be positioned at these different moments on the G7, G20, the Global Fund replenishment, or moving to UHC? Who do you think are going to hook up and carry the message forward? Those two questions. One, which countries are going to show the greatest progress today to prove the concept that we can change the whole game on tuberculosis? Which of the high-burden countries? You've visited all of them.
Well, those are great questions, Steve. I think that the high-burden countries, are the ones that need to understand their epidemics and revisit their domestic investment in their effort. We need to especially identify these countries, India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, Indonesia, and the Philippines as countries that carry 60–70% of the global burden of TB just right there. All of those countries have a growing awareness of their epidemics, but none of them have adequately supported a response that meets the already identified needs of their population. All to say that the unifying theme in the discussion from HIV, from TB, NCDs, and antimicrobial resistance high-level discussions comes together when we pivot to the universal health coverage goal. That goal is the purse string around all of the individual heretofore vertical programmed efforts that the global community and domestic community in concert have converged their resources to respond to. The need to put an integrative frame, as Jen is saying, over what we're doing as we accept the challenge of universal health coverage, the incorporation of the NCDs, not to ignore the vertical programming of HIV, TB, and malaria. All of those efforts need to continue and increase if we are going to have a successful integrated package that begins to address the UHC demand. I believe that the civil society efforts that have happened, and I really wanted to echo Rob's discussion of the stigma issue. It's a strange difference between the TB and HIV stigmas. They're very different. HIV, you don't have the luxury of a cure. You're with the disease for the rest of your life, so it holds the cadre. But I have to say, in observing individuals deal with their TB diagnosis, how they reflect that to their family, how their family reflects it to their larger family and the community they're in. TB is an old disease with a very deeply rooted old stigma, and people treat it as if it has a disproportionate amount of shame associated with it. It's associated with poverty and filthiness, dirtiness, and that's where most of the shame comes from. And very few people who successfully get through treatment and get a cure out of it are interested in turning back to the broader community and being that advocate that we saw happen with the locked in, if I could say that, community of HIV survivors, those who got into treatment, benefited from it. There was less of a barrier for them to turn back and speak kind of to power with it. Nevertheless, that is one of the, I think, central structures, infrastructures that has been created by the high-level meeting. It's a brief opening of a window that will close, but we now need to figure out ways to support civil society, to stop the volunteer effort and move them into a supported, paid for, in part or in whole, wage that will allow them to sit at planning and implementation tables. That's what happened for HIV. We did that through the Ryan White Care Act domestically. It took 11 years to get that going. And even with the Ryan White Care Act, which was the first time resources were made available to have enabling wraparound services supported, it took another decade, actually another 15 years, before that need for a resource motor was realized at the international global level for HIV. Still stuttering, still stuttering. If we can jump over that maturation process that occurred in HIV with TB and on the front end find a way to resource civil society at the planning and implementation tables, I believe we will get a huge lift out of it. The second convergence is realizing that an integrated health package is the future for all the vertical diseases and for NCDs, and it's how UHC has to be delivered, because we can't afford a separate clinic for every disease we've got. So hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease, HIV, TB, and malaria, maternal and child health and family planning and reproductive services all have separate sites. Fortune of money, and it's just an irrational way to roll out a delivery system. So I think it's a moment for us to take a deep breath, use the UHC target, but all of us who come out of vertical thinking, vertical program development, need to ensure that the efforts made for those programs are not diminished, continued, and amplified as they move into an integrated package.
Eric, just while you're on this, can you tell me, I mean, are you expecting to see significant advances coming out of China, South Africa, India in the next 5 years on TB?
I think that India is going to be innovative in its use of the private sector in partnership with the public sector. They're way ahead of everybody else in looking at the barriers to that effort, realizing that the private sector is actually should be embraced as another extension of your delivery system's ability to interface with that population. Give them access to free TB drugs, give them access to diagnostics and lab support if they participate in surveillance. Work out the reimbursement challenges that are there. I think at a local level, understanding the need for profit and where that profit is acceptable in sustaining program versus unreasonable profit margin expansion that many private sector efforts are predominantly focused on. So creating a process that allows for a balanced discussion in how you do that merge with private sector. India is way down the road with these very difficult discussions that will have a generic application. In terms of the research, the United States NIAID in particular, but USAID to a large degree, especially in the vaccine support arena for TB, has been the main support in this effort. Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation have also supported it, but U.S. NIH generally has been the core of the advance. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins are committed, and this is after multiple discussions with them, about revamping their portfolio. This discussion's 2.5 years old. Tony saw this long ago, before that discussion, but because of resource constraints and the way the politics played out, diseases are prioritized. And I think the new availability of funding allowed 2.5 years ago for them to commit, even though they thought it was going to be one-time funding, to an invigorated portfolio that I think they can be proud of at this point. They've aligned it with the Gates Foundation efforts and with the Wellcome Trust efforts. It's been a serious discussion, and I believe it's appropriately prioritized. So natural history, pathophys, vaccine development, new drugs, shortened efforts in terms of duration of treatment, number of drugs used, and side effects from the drugs are all in queue in one place or another. Finally, I would say the BRICS countries have put together a concerted effort to look at their own domestic budgets to invest in a BRICS-focused research agenda. And I know from discussion with these countries that that is at the highest levels in 4 of those countries, and there is a strong desire to want to get out ahead of this. So supporting those type of regional convenings that go down either socioeconomic or the fact that low-income countries now moving to low-middle-income countries are losing funding lines from the Global Fund, but still carry the bulk of the burden of TB. We've got to deal with that as a global community in a way that allows for resource movement to go where burden of disease resides. And I believe all of that has been teed up in this high-level meeting.
Thank you. Peter, what are you looking for downstream now? What are the priorities looking ahead in terms of next steps? I mean, both meetings seem to conclude with a little bit of a standoff between the private sector and others. Both, they have these pathways leading to next things. Russia played a big role in the TB. I'm not sure that exactly that's going to translate into any higher level cooperation, certainly between us and Russia on any of these matters. What do you see as the most important sort of next steps?
Well, I think, as a few people have said, domestic financing is really going to be critical here. And I mean, this is part of the change that we've seen across all of the development institutions we work with, the Global Fund, Gavi, and our own domestic or bilateral programs. You know, the number of low-income countries is shrinking. I mean, this is a good thing. And with TB, most of this burden is now in middle-income countries where it's more difficult for us to operate as donors. And with NCDs, I mean, we talk about the double burden of disease, but the reality is that this is where the burden is coming. And so I don't think we're going to ever see a big donor initiative to address NCDs. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be giving money to Brazil to fight diabetes. So, you know, we need to encourage domestic financing there, and I think being able to do it in a concerted way so that we're all trying to achieve the same things and working with the same tools is really important.
You mentioned in your opening remarks that we had hoped, the U.S. government had hoped that there would be an accountability mechanism, that country plans and targets could be created. And that didn't happen in this case. And that your hope is that that issue won't disappear. If it's not going to disappear, how do you keep that focus on trying to get more precise targets and expectations.
Yeah, well,
accountability.
There was an accountability framework that was developed. What we want to see is an independent review. We have this in the polio world. We have it in maternal and child health. It's very hard for any one organization to be a standard setter and a technical assistance provider, a guidance developer, and as well assess its own work. As a matter of fact, sometimes those of us who are developing guidance need to be held accountable and need someone to say, you know what, I think you're doing this the wrong way. We did get inclusion of the concept of an independent review in the WHO resolution earlier this year. There was also mentioned one in the Moscow Declaration. It fell out of the TB Declaration, but this is something that most of the big donors are have spoken out pretty vocally in support of.
I also wanted to just ask you, it was very significant that Secretary Azar attended and joined also the AMR session. Very important that Deputy Secretary Hargan attended a session that you talked about. What came out of that, of the AMR piece, in your view?
Well, of the AMR piece, I mean, we recognize TB as 1/4 of the AMR cases in the world are in TB, and this is something in this area, the administration, global health, there is no higher priority than global health security, and so we are looking across the array, not only at TB, but of other diseases, at those pipelines of diseases. We're trying to improve surveillance systems, the global health security agenda. We're working with countries to set up emergency operations centers, and we're really trying to build on the framework that we've had these multi-billion-dollar commitments through polio, PEPFAR, TB, maternal and child health. And this, we've been able to see already that this has been the basis, a foundation for our global health security concerns. We're actually able to document, we're more rapidly identifying diseases of unknown origin and being able to respond to them. I mean, what we've seen with Ebola today as opposed to in 2014 is really a night and day difference.
Okay. Let's hear from Lois, Rob, Jan on what you see as the most critical next steps, and then let's open to the audience. Lois?
Sure. I think focusing on the people, that has come through, but I want to continue to echo that, and the importance of what Ambassador Gooseby was saying in terms of really making sure they have formal official support. I can appreciate, having worked with volunteers much of my career, how fatigued they can be, showing up on their own dime often, and we did see a pivot with HIV when we started to treat activists and patient advocates differently. So that point is well taken. I think also on the point of NCDs, recognizing that they too have solvable problems, because this idea that they are big problems, I think it continues to plague that particular community. But whether it's with hypertension or smoking or nutrition or cervical cancer, I mean, these are not kind of, we have to build a hospital to solve this problem things, right? And so really making sure that everyone is getting that message around NCDs in particular, and the best buys that weren't necessarily reflected in the declaration. I think that's also critically important moving forward. And for all these issues, just in full agreement that we as a global health community, really the onus is on us, and I think we're taking that on to speak with one voice and to carry 2 glasses of water. So on one hand, it can be TB, HIV, malaria, what have you, but in this other glass, we have this UHC agenda, and that's really not just so it's politically expedient, but because that's what people need. I mean, people are people, they're not made up of all these different diseases. That's the bottom line. Now, is there a risk of us kind of putting too many ornaments on the tree? Sure. You look at the Alma Ata meeting coming up this month, and there aren't a lot of health ministers showing up to that, and I think it's like they're feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to go to one more thing. And so I am a little bit worried about the UHC kind of mantra for that reason, but it doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. I think we just have to be really smart about it moving forward.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it's how the issue of the NCDs is how do we reduce this for lower resource settings to a digestible path forward, because we keep talking about it at a very high level. And you know, I honestly think part of it's a terminology issue. Maybe it's the English major in me, but you know, I don't think that the frame of non-communicable disease has actually been very helpful, because for lower resource settings, the issue is whether a disease is acute or chronic is actually what really matters. And what I think we've done is sort of siloed NCDs in a way that's not helpful. And I think, you know, Eric, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, but to me, you know, when I got out to Cambodia, you know, people were talking about integration, and they said, you know, you need to integrate HIV into the chronic disease care system. And I went out there and I discovered there was no chronic disease care delivery system. The only one was for HIV. And so I sort of spun that around on its head and said, actually, we have a fantastic chronic disease delivery platform in many lower resource settings, of which this is the only one. And so how do we start to change this dialogue for NCDs to something concrete on the way forward? You know, to really talk about, you know, going from delivering only acute care, and that could be a road traffic accident or malaria, to something that we can deal with HIV and diabetes and hypertension, both with the prevention and with the treatment. And I don't think that's too much of an ask. And I do think that while I don't think the US or other, you know, big you know, bilateral donors are going to create a global fund for NCDs, I do think that we can get diagonal benefits from the investments we are making today. I think we can start to screen patients for diabetes and hypertension who are HIV positive, but I think we can start to make those platforms one where we bring others in and we build out those platforms for delivering services. I actually think this helps with stigma too. If you come to a clinic and you might have HIV or you might have diabetes or you might have hypertension, we start to break down that idea that HIV is something special. I think it's maybe something Tony Fauci said in Durban at the IS meeting. Someone who's diagnosed today with HIV and is 20 years old is going to live a normal life expectancy. And what's going to kill them isn't their HIV. It's going to be hypertension, it's going to be diabetes. So how do we reformulate health systems to address that changing reality?
Jen.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that is the important next step for NCDs on translating the document for the lower resource settings. On TB, I would just say, again, global fund replenishment. I mean, all of these other things are really important, but I think for the future of the TB response, that is the key moment. It's 1 year from this month. So that will be a key moment to focus on for TB community.
Thank you. Eric, any other thought before we move to the audience?
First of all, I'm just reflecting as I hear all these wonderful minds speak to this issue, how uniquely experienced each of you are in saying and culminating in your ability to say what you've each said. It's this ephemeral. I was just struck with how arbitrary it sometimes all seems, but was rejoicing at the content of all of your comments. I think the unifying agenda to me is in the way universal health coverage allows us to acknowledge the strength, the relative strength of platforms that are already standing, such as HIV. It is the strongest platform. The maternal and child health family planning platform is largely dominated by procurement distribution needs and not, you know, clinics, nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, labs, and procurement distribution systems in a setting where you could add high blood pressure, diabetes, and coronary artery disease to it. It's much more the procurement of commodities is what the investment is in. So there aren't that many available platforms in resource-poor settings that can truly be built upon. But I believe as we acknowledge that, it is a moment to pivot back in a partnership with countries to reconverge domestic and donor dollars on that aggregated problem of UHC. So to me, it facilitates the fear that many donor countries have in becoming an entitlement with these resources, and pivots, I think, the relationship into a true partnership where we're both invested in an outcome for a given duration of time and have commitments and accountability to one another to achieve that. The missing leg on that stool is the community. Those who need, depend, and use those services need to be at that table too. But when that's created, it requires an enlightened donor position with it. But I believe it's the future for everyone's main concern that we stand up sustainable, durable, high-quality services that are going to have different cost structures and approaches in each country, but that we're creative enough, smart enough, and committed enough to work through those differences to deliver the program on the ground. And I believe that accountability needs to be country-specific. At a multilateral accountability level has relatively low utility to putting program in place, but has a role, but not the big role. The big role is that internal discussion.
Thank you. Let's turn to the audience here and take several comments and remarks, and we have microphones. Carl Hoffman, please identify yourself and then be very succinct. Down in front here. Down in front, Amisha, over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. And Eric, I don't know if you can see us, but certainly my head, and I think a lot of others, were nodding at all of your points about stigma, about the importance of mobilizing the community and how critical that is, about how all roads lead to UHC. So I just appreciate all the wisdom that's come out so far. I'm sorry, I'm Carl Hoffman with PSI.
Oh, hey, Carl. I thought that was your voice.
Good to see you. I guess I'd like to just take us back to your opening comments, Steve, your opening and your ending comments, right? It's fascinating to recognize how we're all here discussing the importance of moving, and we know this has been underway for some time, from vertical to horizontal and diagonal. We've had this fantastic 15 to 20 years of progress in global health at a time when there was a lot of multilateralism. It was an era of multilateralism. And now, as you pointed out, this is the era of sovereignty, maybe. It's the dawn of this focus on sovereignty and states. And you and I both were at the State Department. We're not afraid of sovereignty. We understand the power of sovereignty. It's not a bad thing. But it's a vertical sort of thing. At a time when I think the challenges that we're talking about and recognizing are much more horizontal. So I guess the question is, if was the multilateral era we're perhaps coming out of crucial to the progress we've seen in global health, or was it just a happenstance? And if we are moving into a more vertical era of sovereignty, are these challenges that we've been talking about here today going to be that much tougher as a result?
Thank you. Do we have any other remarks or comments? David Bryden there and over here. David, look to your left. Please identify yourself and be brief, please.
Sure. Yeah, David Bryden with Results. Two high points for me. One, I was really struck by the presence of African leaders. In Africa, TB has an enormous impact, even apart from HIV. And the way that Tim Evans and Jim Kim made such a powerful pitch to them, bridging this NCD and TB divide around let's tax tobacco to raise funds for the TB response. I thought that was a really fascinating direct appeal that was made to the African leaders that were there. The other high point for me, honestly, is to see U.S. engagement at this meeting. And this really extraordinary investment on the part of Mark Green, a USAID administrator, in his personal prestige and interest and commitment in a subject matter that we would have never seen the previous administrator engage on in that way. In contrast, the previous administrator tried, very deliberately to cut TB and didn't have anything equivalent in that way. So what we're seeing, at least the way it's described, is a real desire to have impact. And so that's something that I'm actually really excited about. The one thing that I thought that did occur to me, though, with U.S. presence was we did have powerful statements from the CDC director and the Secretary of HHS, but no equivalent proposal. So no real description of what is CDC Global Health or CDC's Division of TB Elimination going to do differently now. In spite of the fact, we do have a serious TB situation, costly TB situation in our own hemisphere, in Latin America, the Caribbean, where CDC could play a powerful role. So that to me was a missed opportunity.
Thank you, David. Yes, please identify yourself.
Hi, yes. I'm Teresa Garrison. I work for Development Finance International. I had a question specifically regarding NCDs, and I know we acknowledge that maybe in some respects, identifying NCDs separately, siloed, isn't helpful, but in the context of this conversation, I wanted to raise a question similar to Stephen's question before. So essentially, what countries, especially in the developing world, do you view as leaders in the NCD space and combating NCDs currently? And going forward, who do you expect to be the leaders?
Thank you. Right behind you. Yes.
Yes, good afternoon all. John Shaw, retired Foreign Service, USDA. Maybe I was just being hopeful, but I thought I heard one of the speakers use the term herd immunity. Do we know the role of the other mycobacteria in the developing world? Mycobacteria, bovis, avium, the other tuberculosis.
Okay. So, Peter, can I ask you to open up, and then I want to ask others to jump in. Some specific questions around CDC, HHS, and tax, appeal for taxation.
Yeah, okay. Well, for the U.S., of course, the issue of taxation is always a bit of a difficult one. And I think we've been concerned that sometimes other stakeholders are too quick to reach for that, particularly when you're talking about, with NCDs, it is really difficult when you're talking about people living in poverty and people living in areas where there are food deserts. The idea that, well, let's just go tax all the food that they have access to it's not clear that that's the answer in every circumstance. I think moving forward, the question about CDC and HHS, this really is the future as we move, start to transition away from this very development finance organized world with our engagement of these diseases, that it really is going to be the technical assistance between countries, between ministries of health that we want to encourage. And that is the request that we get from middle-income countries. They really want to get the best expertise that we have in the U.S. government, from NIH, from CDC. And this is a much quieter form of cooperation that goes on. It goes on every day, though. Jimmy Colker, sitting in the audience here, used to be on, when he was at HHS, on quite a few of these missions, sometimes in emergency settings, trying to set this up, and it often didn't get headlines. But this is work that is ongoing. We have very rich cooperation around the world with these ministries. And when it comes to TB, we're investing all this money in TB R&D. We don't have the patient population in the United States. We actually have a remarkably low TB incidence rate, even among OECD countries. And so if we're not going to be able to partner with other countries on the R&D, we're actually not going to be able to get these tools out of the pipeline.
Who else would like to jump in on that one? Rob?
Just a couple different 2 points that I'll respond to. Carl, I think your question is a fantastic one. I think we could have a whole other afternoon on that question, I imagine, Steve. But I guess probably most of us in the room are eternal optimists, or we don't go into the business of global health. I think it's a yes and response. Yes, I think that multilateralism has been fantastic to get us where we are today. And I think if the new reality is a period of sort of increased emphasis on sovereignty, use it. And maybe I'll go back to sort of a malaria example. You know, one of the things that's been really successful in holding African countries to account in malaria is the African Leaders Malaria Alliance in Alma. Joy Pamafi's fantastic leadership in the margins of the African Union meeting each time is holding the leaders to account and showing them where they are in a simple red, yellow, green scorecard. And maybe one of the ways to play it is to actually play up that sovereign competition idea. That, you know, how are we going to extend that model, which has been so successful in Alma, and there's danger in sinking it if you grow it too much, but can we grow that out to some of the other challenges facing Africa, facing Asia, and use that model for good, and saying, you know what, countries, you're going to have to step up. There's going to be decrease in ODA for health. You're going to have to step to the plate. You're going to have to make difficult prioritization decisions, and you're going to have to show each other how you're doing. So I guess that's the best answer I can give in a few seconds to your fantastic question. You asked a very specific question about zoonotic TB and other forms of TB, and I suspect no one else is going to pick it up, so I'll give it a go. So WHO does have a specific plan on zoonotic TB, and it is actually a pretty under-recognized burden of M. bovis. It pales by comparison to sort of, you know, the burden of more typical, you know, mycobacteria tuberculosis, of MTB. But it is a problem, and it's a One Health problem. And I think one of the ways it's being tackled is seen as a One Health thing. And I'm involved in something with the National Academies and training Pakistani scientists in One Health. And this topic is one that's sort of rising up in that form. The other area is atypical mycobacteria, and that's probably hugely under-recognized as a cause of disease, often intractable and terrible disease. But some of the new agents that are emerging in drug development from TB have the potential to be much more effective in the treatment of those conditions. So happy to give you more information offline.
Jay?
Great. Just to pick up something that David was talking about, CDC's role. I think it's a really great point to think about the next 10 years for CDC in this space, because if we agree, and I agree with you that the role of the USG is going to shift over time to be less of a direct financer of responses other than in a subset of countries, and more of a TA partner, resourcing CDC would be really important. And if you look at the TB budget right now, the amount that goes directly to CDC, as you know, is very, very small. And so part of, I think, why we might not have heard a new announcement might be that there's not, right now, it's a very under-resourced, in a sense, part of the USG response. So that would be important to think about for balancing going forward in the role of CDC. On the question of multilateralism and did it play a role in the success of global health, I think it definitely did in many regards. And I agree that it maybe one bright spot in this idea that we're moved away from a multilateral dialogue to some extent and more sovereignty is that because it is really states that have to have their response, it really is appropriate in a sense to have that be the locus of attention and the strategy. So we can sort of piggyback onto that and use it in a good way.
I also wonder if it's appropriate to think, okay, well, if governments aren't able to work in that way, if we're moving away from that kind of framework, at the same time we see this trend towards nationalism at that level. I think a lot of us who aren't in politics are actually finding ourselves reaching even farther across aisles and across countries. And so, does that multilateralism start to apply more to civil society? And can we be more powerful in brokering those partnerships, those ideas, just exchanging sort of best practices or whatever? We haven't been able to maybe test that as much, but I think that that's an exciting opportunity. And it's kind of organically happening again in response to seeing our governments pull back in ways that they have been. On the NCD question though, I won't dare say sort of on record who's doing better versus another country, but I know WHO does put out their reports on NCD, so you might want to reference that. I can say that there are different countries, and I'm out of practice for a few years, but that we used to point to for good examples. So you look at Thailand and the track record that they have had in the past on tobacco control. You look at Mexico, who actually uses this diagonal approach that Robert sort of spoke to. You see South Africa and India dealing with their double burden of disease and helpful, encouraging ways. And so there are definitely some bright spots, but if you check out WHO's resources, you might be able to answer your question there.
If I could just jump in a bit, I appreciate that David brought up the USAID and Mark Green leadership position and the accelerator, the 30 million put towards that. Those type of steps are very important. And it shows some ingenuity and reanimation of AID's role here, and I think that's really important. I'm less certain that CDC and HHS are without interest in moving ahead in different ways. I think the presence was terribly important of the Secretary and the CDC Director, and I also think that if we see any increase in TB within our borders in this next period, you will see the ignition of major initiatives around this. But I also think that in some of our partner states, you can see more potentially on those lines. I want to get to Carl's question. I think the answer to Carl's question is a mixed answer, I think. On the one hand, an era of populist nationalism is fundamentally different from an era of liberal internationalism that favors multilateralism and is optimistic. A populist nationalism is pessimistic. It vilifies globalism. We saw that in President Trump's speech. It casts those forms of cooperation as the enemy and sovereignty as the friendly approach. And in that sense, that doctrine, which isn't just a doctrine of the United States president, it's a doctrine that's embraced by many countries these days, stifles cooperation. It dampens enthusiasm and pushes people away from thinking about cooperative solutions and how to leverage those. And in that sense, I think it's a very dangerous and counterproductive direction to be going, to be opening up by saying the ideology of globalism is mistaken and is the enemy. When you look below the level of that kind of doctrine and ideological expression, though, what you see, at least in our government, is a divergence of behavior. I mean, what we've heard today is about different agencies and different high-level leadership within our own government engaging in a very constructive way. It was not so there is a divergence between and this isn't the only policy area of this administration where there's a divergence between the official high-level doctrine coming out of the White House versus what happens in practice when you get into key agencies and other departmental leadership positions. And I think you can make the case here that it hasn't so dampened the expression of U.S. Influence and leadership that we didn't see leadership expressed. There was leadership expressed in important ways. I think it does lead us on matters of taxation and regulatory reform into a very hardline set of positions that are reflected in this. I think if we'd had a different type of presidency, we would have seen, I think, a very different type of expression around the use of tax and regulatory mechanisms in order to drive down NCDs. The idea of just simply rejecting those out of hand was a matter of ideology. It was not a matter of public health. I do think there was a surprising level of ambiguity or expression around TRIPS on tuberculosis. There was agreement to sort of leave in place the current position, but that was, I think, reflective of within the administration here, its own ambiguity around affordable access and around whether or not there should be steps taken to drive down the costs of medicines, and compromising in the sense of allowing the sort of continuation of a policy that's been in agreement for some time was a positive measure. I know there were fierce battles where there were much tougher positions being argued that we saw as very threatening to intellectual property, and we fought back from that, but not so far as to reject the existing TRIPS arrangements. Do we want to get any other remarks, comments from our audience?
Denise Leonard for Open Health Systems Limited. What I wanted, I agree with, I know the India situation quite well, so I agree that India looks very good. Bangladesh, with respect to TB, the Indian situation looks quite good. The TB situation, Bracken and Grameen working in Bangladesh. When the Chinese put their act together, they'll sort it out, I'm sure. But I'm very unclear about what's happening in Africa and what the next steps are in Africa. And I mean, the back of the envelope, 70% of the cases in Africa with TB are HIV, TB. So I'd like to understand, have implementation methods with high adherence rates been developed in Africa? And are we looking at a funding issue? Or are we still looking at, in each country, some sort of sustainable, effective implementation work has to be done?
Thank you. Other remarks, other comments, questions over here? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Hannah Barkat from the United Nations Foundation. And my question is geared towards TB prevention through faith-based communities. For example, on October 3rd, I attended an event that met with bishops from Central Africa, and they discussed how their role in the church is fundamental against fighting against malaria and having that be the next eradicated disease because of 3 reasons. They have tons of members, they have credibility at the church, and people trust the church as well. So if we model TB prevention like we do with malaria, how are different ways that we can kind of, expedite the process of, eradicating TB?
Thank you. Others? Eric, why don't we come back to you on these questions of Africa and faith to lead off on those?
Yeah, sure. Those are great questions. Africa's carries the largest burden of HIV, and the leading cause of death in HIV-infected persons in Africa, but really in Africa, is tuberculosis. So that marriage is complete on the continent. In 2009, with PEPFAR, we put $180 million on top of country operating plans to strengthen the response already present for the HIV individual being tested for TB, but also, if positive, being referred and started on treatment, strengthening those connections between TB delivery systems and the HIV one was initially kind of not embraced. It wasn't really fought, but it wasn't embraced. And it was really the availability of funding that moved the countries into trying to take advantage of those resources to strengthen their system. I think the community that was supportive of HIV efforts in each of the countries, especially the big ones in Southern Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique to some degree, but South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Swazi were all already, as governments, aware and engaged in their problem, but had not changed budgetary amounts for tuberculosis for 20 years or more. A line item for TB was just continued in the subsequent years' submission for a budget. So, all to say that the lack of a constituency that understands the problem and is empowered and staffed to speak to legislatures, appropriators in their own country legislators, their ministers of finance, and their ministers of health, and I'd list them in that order, is the appropriate approach to getting that funding line addressed and expanded, or at a minimum not ignored. I think we were also successful in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa to get first ladies, like was done with HIV, to adopt tuberculosis as a pet project, if I could say that. And many of the first ladies took it on as their main focus and moved on it. So again, broadening that definition of political will to include appropriators, first ladies, and local leadership in terms of kind of mayors and governors around provinces. is a critical prerequisite. Again, coming back to a constituency that can stay in front of those power structures and be in a continuous dialogue with them. That begins a pressure gradient on politicians to see this as a political issue, which most don't now, and I believe that needs to be our goal. So the support of that in-country cadre of those who have an investment in the service delivery of tuberculosis as it overlaps with other diseases and as it supports the platform that is needed for UHC is all part of the need in Africa. What was the second question?
The second question
Steve?
was regarding the faith community.
Oh, the faith. So HIV learned very early that faith-based efforts were a critical supportive addition to what was usually the public sector delivery system. More often than not, faith-based efforts did not place themselves in a public clinic or hospital, and they often did not place themselves in the capital. Faith-based organizations on entry in the country, usually 40 or 50 years ago, decided to be out of the capital, and because of the burden nature of most bureaucracies in the government, elected not to be part of that stuttered delivery system. But what we found with HIV was, as a result of their placement, they were actually in front of populations that the public sector was not. So using hospitals and clinics of the Ministry of Health did not often put you in front of the entire population you were trying to identify, enter, and retain in care. So they played a critical role in expanding into rural areas, and they would continue to do that for TB. So I see them as a partner that needs to be invoked for all of it, vertical diseases, NCDs, and UHC.
Thank you. We're getting towards the end here. I want to come back to the question of what do we make of these high-level meetings? We have just concluded 2. I think from this discussion we've heard that with mixed results, and also there's a little bit of stay tuned because the true impacts won't be seen for some time. But there was a massive exertion of effort. There's some hope and momentum. There's some interesting new initiatives. There's some new emphasis. But there's also a lot of grumbling, and there's a lot of awareness of the vast gaps in terms of financing, vast gaps in terms of high-level leadership. And there's a certain risk or price of overdoing the high-level meetings. There's a certain risk. I mean, if you do them once a decade, that's one thing. If you're doing 2 a year followed by a third, that's another metric. That's another pace. And you can burn out and discredit these if they look like they're enormous enterprises that sort of end on a sour note. So we have UHC coming up next year. We've had this experience here. So what's the advice that we all up here would give policymakers thinking about what can be achieved, what can be done differently or most effectively in the UHC one next year, but also how are we supposed to, what are we to make of these enterprises? And I'm going to start with you, Jen. Sorry.
That's fine. I was thinking about it as you spoke, and I do think there's a risk of sort of flooding the space with meeting after meeting on different topics that become, less heads of state show up, and it becomes yet another meeting. So we're sort of maybe reaching that a little bit, but I wouldn't want to lose the importance of the TB meeting happening, since it was really the first time that TB had that kind of international stage, which is significant. So I think we should try to hold on to that. But I do think it does set up a challenge for the UHC meeting on how to capitalize, and some of the things that were potentially problematic, not having accountability mechanisms or independent assessments, and not in general, and then also not having the specificity in the NCD case would be lessons for going forward. I think frankly, I think the UHC meeting will be a bigger challenge because it is so all-encompassing.
We went from big to bigger.
Big to bigger, which is going to be hard. But yeah, I think we just have to see these meetings in context as important steps. But I do think they have to be seen as tools that are to be used appropriately. If they keep happening on a regular basis for many different issues, it really does potentially dilute that tool. And so it's a delicate balance.
Rob?
Oh, I totally agree. I think that's very well said. I guess, we talked a bit about the accountability mechanism, but I think for the TB, very quickly translating these global goals into country by country targets, and that, for some of that around, number of missing cases to be found, that should be fairly straightforward. When it comes to who's going to close the $13 billion budget gap, that's going to be trickier. But that actually really needs to happen. And you asked me earlier this week what would be a measure of success coming out of this. And to me, it would be the world following through with that and really saying, what are the numbers of cases that each country is going to find for drug sensitive, for drug resistant missing cases? Where are the missing dollars going to come from to fund this effort? And then some sort of scorecard-like accountability mechanism holding countries, or allowing countries to hold each other to account. So I think that's, and I think going into UHC, that needs to be built in from the beginning, right? There needs to be, and I think for UHC, the thing is, how do we tie UHC and PHC together and break down UHC to something that people understand? I think the problem with UHC is that many people think it's just around health financing. And it's so much more. It's about access to quality services. But we need to figure out what those messages are so that people don't just glaze over. And there are high-level, very important donors who glaze over the minute you talk about UHC. And we need to figure out why that is and what's the strategy to engage them and break this down into a series of concrete steps that are going to move the agenda forward, not only of UHC, but all of these other efforts that we've been talking about today.
Lois?
I want to come back to Jen's framing around sort of messaging and timing, or framing and timing. So I think you're right. Really being clear specifically on how each of these events fits together, I think could be really valuable. So connecting the dots for policymakers so that we understand where we've been with HIV and TB, NCD, and then how that relates to something like UHC. That has not been articulated, I don't think, well enough by our community. And then I think also, in terms of timing, meeting policymakers where they are and understanding that this idea of HLMs is just one tool in the toolbox. We still have G20 and G7, which is, we don't want to get into the habit of just sort of putting all of our energy there, but the fact is we have a lot of different forms or mechanisms that we could be using, and so to the extent we can be better about dividing and conquering, both our community as advocates and also as policymakers, that could be helpful as well. So we understand, okay, we're going to get together in this place, not to talk about all the things, but this set of things. And then likewise for each other forum, we have that sort of approach.
Yeah. Peter, this was true in the Obama administration when universal health coverage came forward. It immediately brought forward our own polarized domestic environment around the Affordable Care Act. It's not a terminology that we're comfortable with. We just recently had this, we were co-hosted with the National Academy of Medicine, a dialogue with the Japanese around both domestic health reform and international health security. Of course, the Japanese are very passionate, long-standing advocates, going back to 1961, of universal health coverage. They're sort of on the other end of the spectrum, and they're a leader in moving forward the TB meeting as well as the UHC one. We're in a totally different place ideologically and politically. So how do you see the administration playing in this, navigating that reality in looking ahead to next fall? And what is your own view, as you look over this collection of high-level meetings, what do you make of it?
Yeah. Wow. All right. So one of the things that I often say is that good policy making should be a result of both aspiration and evidence. And as someone who's been to a lot of these high-level meetings, the thing that often bothers me is when the aspiration gets ahead of the evidence. And sometimes these are an opportunity, they seem more like an opportunity to be sort of self-congratulatory and say things to feel good about ourselves and to really ask tough questions. I mean, I think on things like universal health coverage, this is something where the global health community really needs to start looking at the evidence. You know, we now have, it's no longer simply an aspiration. You know, we have 50 years of evidence of countries trying to pursue universal health coverage. We have rights-based approach. We have very government-centric approaches. And I think we really need to understand not, you know, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. Things work better in different settings. I think we're seeing increasing concern out of Latin America. The term judicialization of health is a big concern, and that fits into this debate. I really welcomed what Rob said about primary health care. You do see that curve is sort of upside down hockey stick in health spending with countries in terms of number of lives saved. And you get a lot of big impact for not a lot of dollars at the bottom of that curve, and it gets really, really difficult as you move along. So I think it has to be seen as a question of prioritization and really asking tough questions and saying, what is the evidence about what works here? And so as we go into these meetings, I think that's what the US government is going to be looking for.
And you think we can navigate the semantics issue? I mean, that's, when we were having this dialogue with the Japanese, we wound up coming up with a variety of different formulations, and the secretary and the assistant secretary, I mean, we had very high-level participation. As once we sort of set aside UHC and settled upon an alternative set of terminological categories, the conversation moved forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when this administration came in, it did review the language we're using on this, as every administration does, and we did spend quite a bit of time on that in the first year. I'm not worried about those issues moving forward. I think we've sort of figured out how to express this view that, you know, every country needs to take its own path. We support the concept of access, that these don't need to be, we're not implying that these are all government-centric systems. And so I think there's widespread acceptance of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Eric, we're going to give you the final word. Congratulations on what you've achieved, and thank you for your leadership and your service in this most recent era on tuberculosis and over your lifespan on HIV and many other issues, both domestic and international. Why don't you tell us sort of your parting thoughts on how we should think about these high-level meetings as you come out of this process?
Thank you. And it's very kind words for you to say that. I would say the same about you. All of you, really, in the chairs. I think that that the high-level meeting really positions us to take advantage of the reality of where we are in our response to tuberculosis, our understanding of the disease, our ability to engage it, our ability to enter and put those burdened with the disease in front of the science that can cure this disease. At the same time, understanding the complexity of the discussion as NCDs and UHC emerge. I take comfort in reminding myself that it is an appropriate goal and target for the global health community to say that everybody should be able to get in front of diagnostic and treatment capability that the science of today creates, and that an individual's inability to get in front of the science that we already know should not be a factor of geography, of money, of religious beliefs, but should be something that the global community sees high utility in making available to everyone. I think that that next step we take as a global human effort to create, to move towards an equal playing field so people can have opportunity to achieve their full potential, not sort of, not theoretically, but really, that we look quantitatively at the disparities that go across socioeconomics and governments to make those, the access to that variable. And we ask ourselves as a global community, are there ethics that we need to bring into the discussion that move appropriators toward a decision that would make a more equitable playing field? Because when the playing field is equal, the disparities that you see are not just on donors to respond to, or just on the individual who got the disease, but we see that we begin to unpack that shared responsibility that I know everybody on this panel and most of the people in the room have dedicated their professional lives to support and expand. So to me, this is part of that march to human beings realizing their full potential. Health and education are necessary prerequisites to that equal playing field, and I think these high-level meetings afford an opportunity to see how a disease process, socioeconomics, social determinants of disease actually all converge on an individual's ability to achieve and maintain a healthy life. But I want to thank CSIS and the Kaiser Family Foundation for having the forethought to put this discussion together. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much, Eric. So please join me in thanking everyone who's contributed here. And thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to Aishwarya Rajan. We're adjourned.